I don't even remember the last time Emily smiled at me the way she did at others, strangers, coworkers, or the neighbor who borrowed our ladder and forgot to return it. Something had changed. It wasn't obvious at first, but the cracks in our marriage weren't just cracks, they were fault lines, trembling under the weight of secrets. I wish I could say it began on a day as ordinary as any other, but it didn't. It started with a question, a laugh, and an offhand remark that planted the seed of doubt in my mind. "Oh, Trevor from the office? He's just a work buddy," Emily had said, brushing me off with a flippant wave of her hand. At the time, I believed her. I wanted to believe her. But belief is fragile. One night, I came home early from a work meeting that had been cancelled last minute. The house was dark, quieter than usual, with an eerie stillness that made my skin crawl. Emily was nowhere to be found, and neither was her car. She must have gone out, I thought. I called her. No answer. Texted her. 3 dots appeared, lingered, and disappeared. No reply. A sinking feeling settled in my chest, but I tried to shake it off. Paranoia wasn't going to fix anything. Yet, as I sat there in our too-empty living room, her laughter from the past week echoed in my mind, sharp and misplaced. She'd been giggling at her phone, brushing off my curiosity with vague answers, just something funny. Funny? Sure. Real funny. That's when the first wave of fury hit me. It wasn't the discovery yet, just the maddening unease of knowing something was wrong and having no proof. The next morning, I decided to do what any self-respecting, suspicious husband would do. I played detective. While Emily was in the shower, I snuck a glance at her phone. Locked. Of course. But luck has a way of taunting you when you least expect it. The screen lit up with a notification, and there it was, a message from Trevor W. "Last night was amazing. Can't stop thinking about it." My heart dropped into my stomach, and for a moment, I felt the room tilt. My hand gripped the phone so tightly I thought it might shatter. Emily emerged from the bathroom, a towel wrapped around her hair, smiling as if she hadn't just set my world on fire. I said nothing. Not then. Instead, I waited until she left for work, and then I did something I never thought I'd do. I followed her. It wasn't hard to figure out where she was going. She wasn't heading to the office. No, her car led me straight to a tidy little suburban house on the other side of town. Trevor's house. I parked down the street, my knuckles white on the steering wheel, staring at the cozy facade of infidelity. It was a nice house. Too nice for someone like him. And then I saw her, my wife, walking up the driveway, laughing into her phone. My world didn't just tilt this time. It imploded. And that's when I decided. No more waiting. No more guessing. No more lies. I grabbed the bat from the back seat, my pulse hammering in my ears, and stepped out of the car. The bat felt heavy in my hand as I walked up the driveway. Each step was a drumbeat in my ears, a countdown to the moment everything would explode. I wasn't thinking, just moving, propelled by a toxic cocktail of rage, heartbreak, and adrenaline. Trevor's front door was ajar, as if he had been expecting someone. How fitting. I shoved it open without knocking, the bat clenched tightly in my fist. And there they were. Emily, my wife, the woman I had promised to love and cherish, was sitting on his couch, wearing my old college hoodie, her legs tucked under her like she lived there. Trevor stood by the window, shirtless, holding 2 glasses of wine. They both froze when they saw me. "David?" Emily's voice cracked, her face draining of color. Trevor, on the other hand, took a step back and raised his hands like I was holding a gun instead of a bat. "Whoa, man. Let's talk about this." Talk? Talk? I let out a short, humorless laugh. "Oh, you want to talk now, Trevor?" Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've already said enough to my wife. Emily scrambled to her feet, her voice sharp and high-pitched. David, stop. This isn't what it looks like. The oldest line in the book. Really, Em? Because from where I'm standing, it looks exactly like what it looks like. I pointed the bat at Trevor. You. Shut up. Sit down. He hesitated, but I took a step forward, and he practically dove onto the couch. Emily was still babbling excuses, her voice breaking, tears pooling in her eyes. But her tears didn't move me. They felt rehearsed, fake, like an actress playing a role she'd performed 100 times before. We were just talking, David. I was telling him about how hard things have been between us. Oh, so this is my fault now? My voice was low, dangerous. No. I just mean. Shut up, Emily. For a second, the room was silent. Trevor sat frozen on the couch, looking like a deer in headlights. Emily stood between us, her arms crossed, her eyes darting nervously. Then, Trevor did something stupid. Really stupid. He smirked. That tiny twitch of his lips, that arrogant little smirk, it was like pouring gasoline on an open flame. Before I even realized it, I swung. The bat slammed into the coffee table in front of him, splintering the wood and sending shards flying across the room. Trevor flinched, throwing his arms up. Emily screamed. Jesus Christ, David, she shrieked. I didn't say a word. My chest was heaving, my vision was blurry with rage. I could feel the veins in my neck straining, my teeth grinding together so hard I thought they might crack. Do you know what you've done to me? I said, my voice shaking with anger. Do you know what it feels like to sit at home, wondering why your wife won't look you in the eyes anymore? Why she laughs at her phone but barely speaks to you? Emily stammered something incoherent, but I wasn't listening anymore. Trevor, on the other hand, found his voice. Look, man. This isn't my fault. She came to me. That did it. I lunged forward, grabbing him by the collar and hauling him off the couch. The bat clattered to the floor as I shoved him against the wall. His bare chest heaved under my grip, and for a split second, I thought about how easy it would be to end him right then and there. But I didn't. Instead, I shoved him back onto the couch, hard enough that he bounced. Emily was screaming my name, her voice shrill and panicked, but I couldn't hear her anymore. I turned to her. How long, Emily? She froze. Her lips trembled, her eyes flicking to Trevor. How long? 6 months, she whispered. 6 months. Half a year of lies. Half a year of betrayal. Half a year of me sleeping next to someone who was already gone. I turned and walked out. I didn't take the bat. I didn't take anything. I just walked out the door and into the cold evening air, my mind buzzing with static. The drive home was a blur. I don't even remember starting the car, but suddenly, I was pulling into my driveway, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. The house felt alien when I walked in, like a crime scene. Everywhere I looked, I saw reminders of her. Her shoes by the door. Her jacket draped over the chair. The faint smell of her perfume lingering in the air. I sank onto the couch, burying my face in my hands. My chest felt hollow, like someone had scooped out everything inside me and left nothing but raw nerves and regret. Somewhere in the distance, my phone buzzed. Emily's name flashed across the screen, but I let it ring. She had her chance. She made her choice. And now, I had to make mine. The phone buzzed again. Emily. Again. I stared at the screen as if it were some venomous creature, waiting for me to reach out so it could sink its fangs into me. Decline. Block. Done. But nothing felt done. I sat in the silence of our living room, the shadows of my home stretching longer as the sun dipped below the horizon. My mind replayed everything: Emily's wide-eyed stare, Trevor's pathetic smirk, the 6-month timeline clanging like a bell in my head. 6 months. I don't know how long I sat there, just staring into nothingness, but eventually, a knock at the door jolted me back to reality. Knock. 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 Slow. Deliberate. I stood up, my body moving on autopilot. My hand hesitated on the doorknob before I yanked it open. Emily. Her face was blotchy from crying, mascara smeared down her cheeks, hair wild and tangled. She looked pitiful. And yet, somehow, even in this state, she carried herself with that same entitled arrogance, the kind that said, "You'll listen to me because you have no other choice." "What do you want?" I said, voice flat. "David, please, we need to talk." "No, you need to talk. I'm done listening to lies." She flinched at that, her eyes glancing down at her feet. "Can I come in?" I stepped aside, letting her in, but I stayed by the door, arms crossed over my chest. She stood in the middle of our living room, arms wrapped tightly around herself, like she was cold. "Say what you came to say, Emily." She took a deep breath, but her voice wobbled when she spoke. "I'm sorry, David. I messed up. I didn't mean for any of this to happen." I laughed. Actually laughed. "You didn't mean for it to happen? What, you tripped and fell onto Trevor's couch 6 months in a row?" Her face twisted in shame, or at least a decent impression of it. "It wasn't like that." "Then how was it, Emily? Enlighten me." She paused, her lip trembling before she spoke again. "You've been distant, David. You've been so caught up in work, in your routines, that it felt like I was invisible to you." There it was. The excuse. The justification. "So this is my fault now?" "No, I'm not saying that," she said quickly, shaking her head. "But it wasn't just about him. It was about me. I felt alive again, David. I felt seen." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. Alive. She felt alive with him. For a moment, I couldn't even look at her. I turned away, running a hand through my hair as I tried to steady my breathing. "Do you love him?" The question hung in the air, sharp and heavy. She didn't answer right away. And that silence told me everything I needed to know. "Get out," I said quietly. "David. Get out." She hesitated, her lips parting like she wanted to say something, but nothing came. She turned and walked out the door, and I slammed it shut behind her. The unexpected visitor. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? My mind was a swirling mess of anger, heartbreak, and something else, something darker. I kept picturing Trevor's stupid smirk, Emily's trembling lip, and the shattered coffee table. Around 3 a.m., I heard it again. Knock. 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 I froze. Emily wouldn't come back this late. Not after the way I kicked her out. Slowly, I approached the door and peeked through the peephole. Trevor. His face was bruised, likely from when I shoved him earlier, and he had the nerve to stand on my porch. I yanked the door open. "You've got 5 seconds to get off my property before I call the cops." Trevor raised his hands in mock surrender. "Hey, man, I just want to talk." "Oh, now you want to talk?" I stepped closer, my voice low and dangerous. "Do you have any idea how close I am to putting you in the hospital right now?" He flinched but didn't move. "Listen, Emily told me she came here tonight. She said you guys talked. Look, I didn't mean for this to get so messy." "Messy?" I repeated, disbelief dripping from my voice. "You blew up my marriage, and you call it messy?" Trevor sighed, looking tired, like he was the victim here. Emily's not who you think she is, man. You think this was just about me and her? She's been seeing other guys too. My blood ran cold. What? She told me I was the only one, but I started noticing things. Late-night texts from random numbers, disappearing for hours without explanation. I think you and I are just two faces in a long line, David. My stomach churned, and for a moment, I thought I might be sick. Trevor was staring at me, his face earnest, or at least trying to be. I thought you should know, he said finally before stepping back off my porch and disappearing into the night. I closed the door and leaned against it, my knees suddenly weak. Other men? Was Trevor telling the truth, or was this some desperate attempt to shift the blame off himself? I didn't know what to believe anymore, but one thing was clear, this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I sat there on the cold hardwood floor, my back pressed against the door. Trevor's words echoed in my head like a broken record. Other men. My first instinct was to dismiss it. Trevor was a liar, a coward, a parasite who had latched onto my wife and drained every ounce of loyalty she had left. But the problem with betrayal is that once trust cracks, it doesn't just break, it shatters. Every word, every glance, every excuse Emily had ever given me replayed in my mind under this new lens. Late nights with the girls. Work trips that didn't add up. The sudden gym obsession. I grabbed my phone and started scrolling through our old text messages, trying to find something. A clue. A crack. And then I did something I never thought I'd do, I opened our phone bill. The numbers didn't lie. There were hundreds of texts and calls to numbers I didn't recognize, some stretching into the early hours of the morning. Trevor's number wasn't even the most frequent contact. There were others, many others. A knot formed in my stomach, tightening until I thought I might throw up. My wife, the woman I built a life with, had turned our marriage into some twisted playground for her amusement. And I was the fool standing in the middle of it, clutching a bat and screaming at shadows while she laughed behind my back. I had to see her again. Not to talk. Not to beg. Just to see her. The setup. Emily hadn't come home. Whether it was guilt or cowardice, she'd stayed away after our argument. I wasn't sure if that made me relieved or furious. Around noon the next day, I saw her car pull into the driveway. She walked into the house like nothing had happened, her oversized sunglasses covering half her face, and a coffee cup clutched in her hand. "David," she started, her voice soft, rehearsed. I was already standing in the living room, her phone in my hand. Her eyes darted to it, and I saw the flicker of panic before she masked it with fake calm. "Unlock it," I said, holding it out to her. Her lips parted slightly. "Why would you want? Unlock the phone?" She hesitated but eventually tapped in the passcode with trembling fingers. I yanked it away the second it unlocked and started scrolling. Her messages told me everything I needed to know. There wasn't just one other guy. There were 3. Different men, different cities. Hotel bookings. Photos. Explicit photos. I threw the phone across the room, and it smashed against the wall. 3 more, Emily. 3. I roared, my voice shaking the walls. Was I not enough? Was our life boring to you? Her mask cracked then. The fake tears dried up, and her face hardened. "Oh, grow up, David," she snapped, crossing her arms. "Do you really think you were some perfect husband? You were predictable. Safe. You were boring, David. Always working, always coming home at the same time, eating the same dinners. I needed more than a roommate with a paycheck." I froze. My breath caught in my throat as I processed her words. "That's what I was to you? A paycheck? A roommate?" She shrugged, her eyes cold. You wanted answers, David. Now you have them. I took a step back, suddenly aware of how alien she felt to me. This woman, this person standing in my living room, was not the Emily I married. She wasn't the woman who used to fall asleep on my shoulder during movies or leave me handwritten notes in my lunchbox. That Emily was gone, if she'd ever been real at all. "You're a monster," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. She laughed, a short, sharp sound that cut through me like glass. "No, David. I'm just honest. And honestly, I don't regret a damn thing." Something inside me snapped. The goodbye. Emily grabbed her purse and started walking toward the door, her heels clicking against the floor like gunshots in the silence. "Where do you think you're going?" I asked. "Out," she said simply. "I'll be back later for my stuff. I'm staying at a hotel." I stepped in front of the door. "You're not walking out of here until you understand exactly what you've done to me." She smirked, God, that same smirk Trevor had worn when I swung the bat. "Oh, David. You'll get over it. Men like you always do. You'll find some sweet girl who doesn't mind your dull little routines. And I'll be out there, living my best life." I stared at her, stunned into silence. Then, I stepped aside. "Go." She hesitated, surprised at how easy it was. But then she walked past me, her perfume lingering in the air like a ghost. The door closed softly behind her, and I stood there in the quiet aftermath, surrounded by the ruins of my marriage. For the first time in months, the house felt empty. The next step. That night, I did something I should have done a long time ago. I called a lawyer. The process of divorce isn't glamorous. It's slow, painful, and messy. But it was necessary. In the following weeks, Emily made her true colors clearer than ever. She tried to fight for the house, the car, even my retirement fund. She dragged me through the mud, and every interaction felt like pouring salt into an open wound. But through it all, I kept my head up. I started going to the gym. I reconnected with old friends. I spent time doing things I enjoyed, not things I did because they were convenient for someone else. And slowly, painfully, I started to heal. But I'll tell you one thing, betrayal changes you. It sharpens your edges and hardens your heart. And if you're lucky, it teaches you one undeniable truth. Sometimes, the person you love the most is also the one holding the knife. Divorce isn't the clean break people think it is. It's a war. And Emily? Oh, she was a soldier. She came at me with every trick in the book, fake tears in mediation meetings, crocodile sobs in front of the lawyer, and carefully crafted text messages trying to reel me back in with half-baked apologies. But I was done. The weeks passed like molasses, slow, heavy, and sticky with resentment. But during those long nights, staring at the ceiling of an empty bedroom, I realized something. I wasn't mourning her. I was mourning the version of her I thought was real. One night, as I was halfway through a bottle of whiskey, I got a text from an unknown number. "You deserve to know everything. Meet me tomorrow. 7 p.m. Lucky's Bar." No name. No explanation. I stared at the message, debating whether it was worth chasing more ghosts. But curiosity, or maybe self-destruction, got the better of me. The meeting. Lucky's Bar was the kind of place where you'd find lonely men nursing watered-down drinks and bartenders who'd seen it all. The neon sign buzzed above the entrance, flickering like it might give out at any second. I walked in, scanning the crowd until I spotted him. Trevor. He was hunched over a drink in the corner booth, looking rough. His eyes were sunken, his face pale, and his usual smirk was nowhere to be found. I walked over and sat across from him. "What do you want, Trevor?" He took a deep breath, his hands trembling slightly as he set his glass down. "David. I messed up. I shouldn't have gotten involved with her. But there's something you need to know. I crossed my arms, my voice cold. Spit it out. She's not done with you. I frowned. What does that mean? Trevor leaned in closer, lowering his voice. Emily's been telling people things about you. Bad things. She's painting you as unstable, dangerous, even violent. She's setting up a case to take everything, the house, your savings, everything. The blood drained from my face. What? She told me she's going to push you until you snap. Get you on record losing your temper, maybe even hitting her. And then, well, she wins. My chest felt tight, like the air had been sucked out of the room. Emily wasn't just leaving me, she was trying to destroy me. I stood up abruptly, knocking my chair back. Why are you telling me this? Trevor looked down at his drink, his voice small. Because I'm done being her puppet. I've seen what she does to people, and I don't want to be part of it anymore. I turned and walked out of the bar, the cold night air hitting me like a slap to the face. The trap. The next few days were a blur. I hired a new lawyer, someone sharp, someone who could cut through Emily's manipulative facade like a scalpel through tissue paper. But Trevor's warning lingered in my mind. Emily was going to push me. She was going to provoke me until I snapped. And she almost succeeded. It happened one Saturday afternoon. Emily came to the house to pick up some of her stuff. She was wearing her usual mask, fake tears, soft voice, sad eyes. David, can we please just talk, she said, stepping into the living room. No, I said flatly. Take your things and leave. But she didn't move. Instead, she walked closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. You know, Trevor wasn't even the best one. There were others, so many others. And do you want to know something, David? They were better than you. In every way. I felt the rage boiling under my skin, my fists clenching at my sides. She smirked, stepping even closer. Come on, David. Hit me. Scream at me. Do something. Show me who you really are. It was a trap. I could feel it. Somewhere, maybe in her purse or her pocket, she probably had her phone recording. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and stepped back. Get out, Emily. Her smirk faltered. Get out. She huffed, her face twisting in frustration as she grabbed her bag and stormed out the door. I stood there for what felt like hours, my chest heaving, my heart pounding in my ears. I had almost fallen for it. Almost. But I didn't. The breaking point. The final blow came a week later. My lawyer called me with an update. David, we've managed to subpoena Emily's financial records. There's something you need to see. I sat in the lawyer's office, staring at a stack of printed bank statements. There were deposits, huge ones, coming from different accounts, all within the last 6 months. What is this? I asked. My lawyer adjusted his glasses. It looks like Emily's been blackmailing some of her acquaintances. Including Trevor. Blackmail. She wasn't just cheating. She was running some kind of twisted scheme, using her affairs as leverage. The disgust I felt in that moment was indescribable. She's a predator, I said quietly. My lawyer nodded. And we're going to make sure she doesn't get away with it. The calm before the storm. I walked out of that office with a sense of clarity I hadn't felt in months. Emily was going to fall, and she was going to fall hard. But not because I was going to stoop to her level. No. I was going to let the truth do the work for me. I sat in my car, staring at the city skyline as the sun dipped below the horizon. Emily thought she had played me. She thought she had won. But the game wasn't over. Not yet. The day of the court hearing felt like stepping onto a battlefield. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in the courthouse hallway, and the scent of stale coffee and cheap perfume hung heavy in the air. I sat on one side with my lawyer, Mark, a sharp, no-nonsense guy with salt and pepper hair and a permanent scowl. Emily sat on the other side, wearing a pencil skirt and a fake air of vulnerability, clutching a tissue like it was an Oscar-winning prop. She looked at me and smirked. That damn smirk. Mark leaned in and whispered, "Keep your head straight, David. Don't let her bait you." I nodded, though my fists clenched at my sides. The bailiff called us into the courtroom. Emily's lawyer, a greasy guy named Carter, stood up first and began spinning a tale so ridiculous it could have been straight from a soap opera. "Your Honor, my client has been subjected to verbal abuse, emotional manipulation, and even threats of violence from Mr. Callahan. She's afraid for her safety, and she's simply asking for what's fair: security, financial stability, and protection from her volatile husband." I could feel the anger bubbling up in my chest, but Mark shot me a look that said, "Not yet." Emily dabbed her eyes with her tissue, sniffling like she was auditioning for the Real Housewives of Divorce Court. When it was our turn, Mark stood up and spoke with the calm confidence of a man who had done this 1,000 times. "Your Honor, my client has remained respectful and composed throughout this entire ordeal, despite being subjected to not only infidelity but financial fraud and blatant emotional manipulation. I have evidence to prove Mrs. Callahan's involvement in blackmail schemes, multiple affairs, and attempts to provoke my client into acts of aggression to gain leverage in this very courtroom." The air in the room shifted. Emily froze. Her lawyer stammered, "Objection, Your Honor. That's baseless." Overruled. Mr. Callahan's counsel may continue. Mark laid out the bank records, the subpoenaed messages, the deposit slips, all of it. Each piece of evidence felt like a nail in Emily's coffin. She stopped dabbing her eyes. Her smirk was gone. And then Mark dropped the final bombshell. "We have also obtained a sworn affidavit from one of Mrs. Callahan's acquaintances, Mr. Trevor Grant, who has provided testimony detailing her plans to provoke Mr. Callahan into violent outbursts to manipulate the outcome of these proceedings." Emily's face turned white as a sheet. She shot up from her chair. "That's a lie," she shrieked, her voice cracking. "This is all fabricated." The judge banged his gavel. "Mrs. Callahan, sit down or I'll have you removed from this courtroom." For the first time in months, I felt something close to victory. The aftermath. The court adjourned, and the judge ordered a temporary freeze on Emily's access to our joint assets while an investigation was conducted. She stormed out of the courtroom, her heels clicking against the marble floor like machine gun fire. I followed her out into the hallway, not because I wanted to talk, but because I needed to see her face one last time before this chapter was over. She spun around, her face twisted with venom. "You think you've won, David? You think you're better than me? You're pathetic. You'll always be pathetic." I took a step closer, keeping my voice steady. "No, Emily. I'm free. Free from you, free from your lies, free from the mess you turned our marriage into. And you know what? You're going to have to live with that." Her eyes narrowed, and for a split second, I saw fear in them. Then she turned and walked away, her fake designer purse swinging by her side. The twist. 3 days later, I got a call from Trevor. "David, it's bad. She's losing it." "What do you mean?" "She's been calling me non-stop, threatening me, saying she's going to make us both pay. I'm getting out of town, man. I suggest you keep an eye on your back." And just like that, the uneasy feeling returned. That evening, I installed new security cameras around my house. I double-checked the locks on every door and window. Emily had lost the battle, but cornered animals are always the most dangerous. At around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of shattering glass. I jumped out of bed and grabbed the baseball bat I'd kept by my nightstand since that night at Trevor's house. My heart was pounding in my ears as I crept downstairs. The living room window was smashed, glass scattered across the floor like diamonds in the moonlight. And then I saw her. Emily stood in the middle of the living room, barefoot, her mascara streaked down her face. She was holding a kitchen knife. "Emily, put the knife down," I said slowly, keeping my distance. She took a shaky step forward, the blade catching the faint glow from the streetlight outside. "You ruined me, David. You took everything." "No, Emily. You did this to yourself." For a moment, I thought she was going to lunge at me. But instead, she dropped the knife, let out a guttural scream, and collapsed onto the floor, sobbing into her hands. I called the police. They arrived within minutes and took her away, her wrists cuffed behind her back as she was led out to the squad car. The reflection. In the days that followed, I felt something I hadn't felt in months: peace. The divorce proceedings wrapped up shortly after. Emily was charged with breaking and entering, and with the financial evidence stacked against her, she walked away with far less than she had expected. I stood in the empty house one evening, sipping a glass of whiskey, staring out the window at the sunset. I wasn't broken anymore. I wasn't angry, or sad, or bitter. I was free. And sometimes, freedom doesn't come from winning, it comes from letting go. In the weeks following Emily's arrest, life settled into an eerie calm. The house felt quieter, lighter, as if her presence had left a physical weight in the air that was now gone. The divorce was finalized, cleaner than I expected, thanks to the evidence Mark had meticulously laid out in court. Emily was stripped of any financial claims, left with nothing but her tarnished reputation and mounting legal fees. I should have felt victorious. But instead, there was an odd hollowness. You don't just spend years with someone, build a life together, and then erase it like chalk on a sidewalk. Even if that person turned out to be a manipulative, cheating hurricane of chaos. One evening, I stood by the window with a glass of whiskey, staring out at the empty driveway. For the first time in months, I let myself truly exhale. But the universe has a cruel sense of humor, doesn't it? My phone buzzed on the counter. Unknown number. I hesitated before answering. "Hello?" A familiar voice slithered through the line. "Emily." "David." Her voice was low, trembling, but still carrying that underlying edge of venom. I stayed silent, letting her fill the void. "You think this is over? You think you've won?" she whispered. "You have no idea what you've started." Before I could respond, the line went dead. My skin prickled with unease, and I set the phone down carefully. I knew better than to underestimate Emily. She was the kind of woman who didn't believe in losing. But what more could she possibly do? The trap is set. 3 days later, I got an unexpected visit. Mark called me early in the morning, his voice tight with urgency. "David, we need to meet. Now." I met him at a coffee shop downtown. He was already seated, papers spread out in front of him, looking more stressed than I'd ever seen him. "She's trying to countersue, David," he said, cutting straight to the point. "For what?" I asked, incredulous. "Defamation. She's claiming emotional distress, financial ruin, and she's trying to say you coerced Trevor into testifying against her." I let out a humorless laugh. "That's ridiculous. There's evidence, bank records, text messages, she's done. This won't stand up in court." Mark shook his head. "You're right, it won't. But that's not the point. She's not trying to win. She's trying to bleed you dry with legal fees. She wants to exhaust you until you're begging for it to end." I sat back in my chair, feeling that old, familiar anger bubbling up in my chest. "What's our move?" Mark leaned in. "We fight fire with fire. But David, be prepared. This is going to get ugly. The final straw. That night, I came home to find something strange on my doorstep, an envelope. No address, no name, just a plain white envelope sealed shut. I opened it carefully and felt my stomach drop. Inside were printed photos. Photos of me. Me at the bar with Trevor, me outside the courthouse, me sitting alone in my car staring at my phone. Someone had been watching me. Following me. And in the bottom corner of one of the photos was a blurry reflection in a car window. Emily. I clenched the photos in my hand and stormed inside, grabbing my phone to call Mark. But before I could dial, another text came through. Let's talk. Midnight. The old park bench where we used to sit. Come alone. The rage in my chest was boiling over, but beneath it was a creeping sense of dread. I knew I shouldn't go, I knew this had trap written all over it. But I had to end this. Midnight meeting. The park was dead silent when I arrived. A single street lamp flickered overhead, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. The bench was still there, weathered and warped from years of neglect. Emily was already sitting there, her figure partially obscured by the shadows. She was wearing a long coat, her face barely visible beneath the hood. I approached cautiously, gripping my phone tightly in my pocket. What do you want, Emily? She stood up slowly, her movements deliberate. I wanted to see you one last time, David. Before everything burns. Before what burns? I snapped. She let out a dry laugh, hollow and chilling. You still don't get it, do you? This was never about love, or revenge, or money. It was about control. And even now, even after everything, I'm still pulling the strings. She stepped closer, and I caught the faint glimmer of something metallic in her hand. A knife. I stepped back, my heart pounding. Emily, put it down. She tilted her head, her voice a twisted mockery of affection. You always were so predictable, David. So easy to read. Suddenly, headlights cut through the darkness, and the sound of screeching tires shattered the silence. 2 police cars came barreling into the parking lot, sirens wailing and lights flashing. Officers jumped out, guns drawn. Drop the weapon, one of them shouted. Emily froze, her face twisted with fury and disbelief. You set me up, she screamed at me, her voice cracking. No, Emily. You set yourself up. She dropped the knife, and the officers swarmed her, pinning her to the ground as she thrashed and cursed. I stood there, breathing heavily, watching the woman I had once loved get handcuffed and dragged away under the cold glare of flashing police lights. The end of the line. Emily was charged with stalking, harassment, and violating the restraining order that had been quietly filed against her after the break-in. Her web of lies had finally collapsed under the weight of her own arrogance. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, I could finally breathe without looking over my shoulder. I sat on my porch the next evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Emily was gone. The storm had passed. But I knew one thing for sure, monsters aren't always hiding under our beds. Sometimes they're sitting across from us at the dinner table, wearing smiles we've grown to trust. And when the mask slips, you better be ready for what's underneath. The courtroom was nearly empty the day Emily's sentencing was handed down. The judge's voice was firm, cold, and unyielding as he listed her charges: stalking, harassment, violation of a restraining order, and malicious intent to harm. She sat there in a beige prison uniform, her hair tied back, her eyes hollow. When the judge announced her 5-year sentence with no possibility of parole, Emily didn't flinch. She just stared straight ahead, her lips curling into the faintest smirk, as if she still had one last trick up her sleeve. But she didn't. When it was over, she was escorted out of the courtroom, her wrists bound in cold steel. For the first time since all of this started, I felt nothing. No anger. No satisfaction. Just an odd, quiet emptiness. Closure and ashes. A month later, I stood in what was left of our old home. The house had been sold, stripped of its memories and its ghosts. Boxes were stacked by the door, filled with whatever pieces of my life I had decided were worth keeping. I found one last box in the corner of the attic, a shoebox filled with old photos of Emily and me. Smiling at the beach. Laughing over dinner. Dancing barefoot in the living room. For a second, I let myself feel it. The love, the hope, the naive belief that we'd somehow be different from every other couple that crumbled under the weight of betrayal. Then I closed the box and set it down in the pile marked trash. Some things aren't worth carrying forward. New horizons. Life moved on, as it always does. I sold the house, moved to a smaller place downtown, and threw myself into rebuilding, not just financially, but emotionally. I reconnected with old friends I had let slip away during my marriage. I started hiking on weekends, joined a boxing class to release the residual anger, and found quiet joy in the mundane: morning coffee, evening walks, a good book on a rainy day. One afternoon, while waiting in line at a coffee shop, I struck up a conversation with a woman named Sarah. She was witty, sharp, and had a laugh that made the whole room feel lighter. There was no grand romantic moment, no cinematic montage of us falling in love. Just small conversations, shared smiles, and the gentle realization that I was ready to let someone into my life again. A final encounter. 2 years later, I received a letter. The return address was a women's correctional facility. Emily. I debated throwing it away without reading it, but curiosity won out. The letter was short, barely half a page. David. I hope you're happy now. I hope you found peace. Because I haven't. And I never will. But you won. You were always the better person. Goodbye. Emily. There was no apology, no admission of guilt, just emptiness. I stared at the paper for a long moment before folding it neatly and tossing it into the fireplace. The flames licked the edges of the paper, curling it into ash, and I watched until every trace of her words was gone. The lesson. If you'd asked me years ago what the worst thing in the world was, I'd have said betrayal. The knife in the back kind, the trust-shattering kind. But I was wrong. The worst thing isn't the betrayal, it's what you let it turn you into. Emily tried to drag me down with her into that pit of lies, anger, and bitterness. But I climbed out. Scarred, yes. Wiser, definitely. But not broken. The truth is, people like Emily don't destroy you unless you let them. So if there's one thing I've learned through all of this, it's this. When someone shows you their true colors, don't try to repaint them. Just walk away. The end. It was a crisp autumn morning when I stood on the balcony of my new apartment, coffee in hand, watching the sun rise over the city skyline. For the first time in years, the horizon felt wide open, limitless. Emily was a chapter, a dark, twisted chapter, but just a chapter nonetheless. And now, the page had turned. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and let the past fade away with the morning light. Because sometimes, the best revenge isn't anger, or victory in court, or dramatic confrontations. It's simply, moving on.